Thanks very much, Dwayne, and hi everyone. It is lovely to be here. So I will briefly introduce myself and then let Jon introduce himself, and then we'll get into discussing the power of citizens, which is the topic of today. So my name is Julie Wilson-Dodd. I am a transformation consultant who works with nonprofits, particularly charities and other NGOs. Transformation consultant is a very vague title. What it means is I work with organisations to help them think about how they can change the way that they approach their work to scale up, to deliver more impact. And through the work I've done with Jon over the years, increasingly that's about how they can scale up and do more with people rather than just for and on behalf of people, which we will come to in much more detail. I now work part-time with Jon's the consultancy that Jon founded called the New Citizenship Project, which is all about affecting the citizen change in organisations. So you'll hear examples from that world too. Jon, do you want to do a very brief intro to you, and then we'll get into the questions?
Yeah, I spent the first 10 years of my career working in the advertising industry, which was by turns exhilarating and soul destroying, and sometimes both, and then sort of stumbled out through a few years working at the National Trust, and then starting to really build the framework of ideas that's now at the heart of the book. I wrote an actual book. Where I talk about a shift from subject to consumer to citizen as the idea of the individual in society, and that sort of set of ideas sits at the heart of the New Citizenship Project, as Julie knows all too well. But we've been really playing with them and trying to understand really what it means, what it might look like for organisations of all shapes and sizes and sectors to treat people as citizens rather than just as consumers ever since, and been able to learn from and work with some fascinating people, not least along, if that was the direction you are, you might be that side on my screen, so I'll do that just in case. And learn from the people we've been working with along the way. So yeah, that's probably the quickest version of me. 10 years in advertising, about 8 years trying to figure out how to undo all the damage I'd done.
Thanks, Jon. And yeah, if I briefly kind of recap how we met, because I think it's really pertinent to this story. It was 12 years ago, and I was working at a digital agency at the time that worked mostly with charities, and you came to us with a brief that was, if I boil it down to its pure essence, was we'd really like to hand over a National Trust farm to everyday people to run. And I thought, yeah, cool. Yeah, let's do that. And if I'm honest, my interest in the project at the time was really about the innovation side of it. I thought it was a really interesting way to approach a project with an organisation that, even though I'd been a member of the National Trust for a long time, I saw in a very kind of traditional, top-down hierarchical model. And to hear that somebody from the National Trust wanted to hand over a prize bit of their estate to everyday people like us to run, particularly piqued my interest. But I think at the time I was interested in the innovation mechanic rather than the participation side of things. Through that work, I really came to learn the power of participatory involvement. We let people make decisions on everything from, what grain stock we should be moving to, through to whether one of the prize bulls that was coming to the end of its useful life in terms of being a stud should be put down or not. Literally the power of life and death was handed over to some thousands of people who were taking part entirely online through Wimpole Farm. And it was a really, really fascinating experience. Certainly what I learned as I went into other organisations, I became the director of comms and then the director of transformation at Parkinson's UK for 5 years, was that the traditional model of charities and I think other kinds of NGOs was really born out of a Victorian era of philanthropy, where the intention is positive, but it is very paternal, slightly patronising maybe. This kind of, you give us some money and we will do the good work for you and look after you. The organisation I joined was still very much in that mode, but desperate to listen more to that community of people living with Parkinson's and their loved ones, but had no mechanics to do that in that traditional philanthropic model. I've also worked as a consultant with, I think, charities who fit more of the consumer model, and I'll ask you in a minute, John, to explain the whole subject, consumer, citizen model. But the idea of charities moving to a world where high brand focus, engagement, fundraising, something that's much more about give and take. So you give us money and we'll go and do this thing over there, that felt much more familiar, I guess, in some ways, but not necessarily more positive in terms of how nonprofits could run. So yeah, I will stop talking because this is really a session to hear from you, John. But certainly you told me the story of the stories of subject, consumer and citizen, and it was an idea that lodged itself deep in my brain. I've never been able to unthink it since, and I'm hoping that this will be the same effect that happens to everybody in the session today. So I'm going to ask John, I'm going to hand over to John to talk for a bit. I'll ask some questions, but as Dwayne said, if you've got questions, pop them in the ask a question, and we'll make sure we pick up on those. So John, yeah, maybe for people who aren't familiar with the subject, consumer, citizen narrative, if you can just talk people through it as a starter.
So yeah, great. I mean, so I guess where I want to start maybe is, and where I try and start in the book is actually somewhere I wasn't originally, which is I think the first assertion I want to lay down is that humans are citizens by nature, that we are inherently collaborative, creative, caring creatures who can and want to make the world a better place. And I think that is my, I'm happy to debate it and get into the nuts and bolts of it, but that is my sort of starting assertion in all of this work. And I think if you start from there, it's actually deeply kind of challenging and profound to work with that. Now where I go from there is that actually the second sort of belief about human nature, I suppose, is that we are also storytelling and story dwelling creatures, that while we are collaborative, creative, caring by nature, we are also deeply shaped by the stories that surround us. And I think that over the last several hundred thousands of years, the historical range of the book, as you know, is slightly ambitious. I go back to King Sargon of Akkad in 2500 BC, but what I talk about is a shift from the subject story to the consumer story, and then potentially to the citizen story, but always arguing that underneath we are citizens by nature. So the subject story, which was dominant until the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th, is a story that says the right thing to do is to keep your head down, do as you're told, get what you're given, on the basis that the God-given few who run society know best, and they'll sort of lead us to the best outcomes for society as a whole. And this story shows up in every aspect of our lives and in every kind of organisation. And it's often here you referred to Victorian morality, like that. It is Victorian morality. Like this is the morality of the British Empire. This is the kind of the do your duty kind of norms. And the way it shows up in a lot of major charities that were founded in that time, including the National Trust you've already mentioned, and many others, is it shows up as this kind of paternalistic role where we know best, the little people need to be kind of protected, and in return for their obedience and their kind of and their dutifulness, they will be looked after. And Octavia Hill, who's one of the founders of the National Trust, spoke directly to some of this logic. But what happened at the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th, is that rise of the middle class, the Industrial Revolution, so on and so forth. You just couldn't sustain that subject story as a core story of the way society worked anymore. And I believe that the two world wars were actually a kind of a consequence of that story falling apart, which we'll come on to the relevance of for right now in a moment. But the subject story collapsed. Out of the two world wars, we moved more or less explicitly and deliberately into the consumer story. And the consumer story says the right thing to do is to get the best deal for yourself, look out for number one, get the best deal for you from the options that are offered, on the basis that the way to the best outcomes for society as a whole is to aggregate individual self-interest. If everyone looks out for themselves, which is all we're capable of doing because we're kind of quite selfish creatures, then that can be channeled into creating the best outcomes for society as a whole. And you see this, just to again segue into organizations and particularly NGOs, that you see this showing up, because what it does is it takes us into the world of benefit driven membership and these sorts of things, and it tells us that an organization needs to compete for donations and support, and then carry on doing its kind of paternalistic work over here in the background, and I think leaves us kind of, it's better in a sense, just as the consumer story as a whole is better than the subject story. It creates more freedoms, it's more creative on a relative basis, but it's fundamentally limiting because it's rooted in that assumption that people are kind of selfish and narrow-minded. And what I believe we are living in right now, the moment in time that we're in, I think, is an analogous collapse. I think just as the subject story collapsed at the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th, the consumer story is falling apart now. The contradictions at its heart, the idea that actually, when you step back and think about it, its logic is incredibly Orwellian. It's like selfishness is selflessness. Like it just can't hold. And the symptoms of its kind of overreach and deep kind of flaws are everything from the climate emergency, which intensifies even as we're sort of the only agency we're given is to choose slightly better products or like take a shorter shower or whatever, to pervasive inequality which continues to kind of grow and multiply, even as we're sort of surrounded by a story that's telling us to consume constantly, like through the medium of advertising and what I think we're trapped because we can't. The risk is, in this moment, all we can see is the possibility of rebooting that story and this sort of idea of back to normal, or a descent into the subject story, the kind of rise of authoritarianism, fashion, and particularly in the last few weeks, that's obviously very, very live and present. And I guess the reason why I wrote the book and wasn't just happy to continue the work we're doing. The work we do is about the subject, is about the citizen story, is about saying people actually, the right thing to do is to get involved, to share your ideas, energy, and resources to the pursuit of the best outcome for society as a whole, because all of us are smarter than any of us, and that's how we'll figure it out. And for organizations and leaders to encourage others to share their ideas, energy, and resources, to tap into the ideas, energy, and resources of everyone, to hold space rather than to try and deliver services. And I think that work, as I say, we've been doing for a good few years, but in this moment, and by this moment I sort of mean the last 24 months or so, but I sort of mean the last 5 weeks, like, we need to be able to see that this actually could be a way of organizing ourselves. It can be a way of transforming our organizations, to use your language, Julie. And if we can see that and step into it, this actually could be a moment of incredible opportunity. And it is bubbling everywhere. The idea essentially is to go, subject organizations do stuff to people, they command and conquer, people obey and do as they're told. Consumer organizations do stuff for people are those organizations serve, and people demand and choose. But in a citizen story, people do stuff together with and through organizations, and the role of an organization is to facilitate and hold space, and the role of people is to create and participate, and that is who we are and what we want to be.
Thanks, Jon. And there's a chapter in the book that you labelled citizen NGOs. I think probably particularly relevant to the group of people who are going to be joining in with this conversation. I'm really interested in where you think you're seeing the right sorts of shifts in the organisations that we work in, moving towards that, citizen story rather than being stuck in the subject or caught in the consumer one.
I think when you have this language, and I think one of the reasons why it is such an earworm for people is that it helps you sort of hold things up and see where some of these behaviours are. Because the truth of the moment in time, I think, is that in all organisations there are citizen things happening. There are pockets of this sort of activity. Yet most organisations are still trapped in that dominant consumer story, and and sometimes even trapped in their deeper roots, as you alluded to in the subject story. But to give you, like, what I do in the chapter on citizen NGOs is set out like the work I was part of, and the project you referred to, the My Farm project, was sort of one part of the National Trust, because I think the trust is on this journey, and is maybe further ahead than some. And when we started this work, the trust was very much, I mean, in a way, it had both a subject organisation and a consumer organisation existing in the same place. There was a sort of paternalistic conservation charity looking after beautiful places, kind of in spite of people, and a bit worried about what people might do to them. And then there was a visitor attraction business that was sort of selling tickets and memberships to people, but really memberships that were memberships of the National Trust that didn't really surface any cause. And what the work we were doing was about saying, well, actually, it's the relationship between people and beauty, between people and special places, that matters most, and that is the citizen relationship. And what if we tried to step into a role where the National Trust wasn't on the one hand a conservation charity and on the other hand a visitor attraction business, but was actually a kind of, I use the language in the book of putting the organising back into organisations, and it's like was organising a movement of people who care about beauty and care about place, and that manifested itself in the world in some really fun ways, right? So the first example was that I love talking about, because is that when we started the work, there was a group of staff who were called wardens, and their uniforms were camouflage, and they were sort of conservation charity employees, and their role was really to kind of protect nature from children, to sort of jump out from behind trees at the vital moment and make sure nothing was harmed. And yet, to your question of like, where is this happening? Like, these were people who were, so once they got their day jobs done and once they fulfilled the job description, we're actually like running den building and adventure walks and bug spotting and mud pie making and all this sort of stuff, like, without it being part of their jobs. And we were like, well, actually, they're the front line. They're the relationship between people and place. So what if we unleash that? And they became known as rangers. Their uniforms were red. They got training in social media to be voice of the organisation. And they were placed into an organisation that was about building the relationship between people and place, rather than protecting nature from people. Another example was a campaign that, when it was in development, was very much so that example comes from the conservation charity. Another example comes from the marketing side of the business, the visitor attraction business, and there was a marketing campaign in development called Get Outdoors with the National Trust that was about sort of selling more outdoor tickets and changing perceptions and this kind of thing. And we stepped away from it and went, well, what's the relationship between people and place we'd like to build in the outdoors? And the conservation teams were like, well, there's a problem of generational disconnect, and there's evidence that if you build a personal connection to nature by the age of 12, then you're more pro-environmental later in life. And so we said, well, there's all these wardens doing like den building and stuff, and there's this need, and there's and focused on the relationship between children and nature. And we made that campaign, Get Outdoors with the National Trust, was reinvented as 50 things to do before you're 11 3/4, crowdsourcing the list of ideas and all that sort of stuff. We made a film called Project Wild Thing. Like, it just unleashed huge energy and creativity by putting the power into people's hands. People inside the organisation and people outside the organisation, and trusting in them and in their desire to have a positive relationship to place, rather than sort of the sort of protecting nature from them and expecting them to be ignorant and damaging, but on the other hand appealing to their self-interest and trying to sell them tickets for a nice day out without ever trying to open up to them the deeper experience. And so that's, I think, a really good example of how this work can manifest. But I think more broadly, it's really about saying about that shift in the focus on relationship and the shift to trusting people, and saying, like, what if we do see our role as being to build agency and to put power in people's hands, rather than in relation to the cause we're part of. rather than do it for them. And like the work you and I were both involved in at Parkinson's was really about saying, like, how can we recognize that that what Parkinson's does more than anything else is take people's agency away, and if we see that as a fundamental human need, then how can we see our role actually as being to involve people in and renew that agency and hold the space for them to be able to shape their world again, and help them not let Parkinson's do that to them, rather than see our role as being to, like, look after. I mean, yes, of course there is provision of service and so on. I'm not ignoring that, but very deeply, if we come from this conception of people, then the role of an organization, a health charity like that, changes the role of a climate organization. And I think Friends of the Earth are doing this really well with their shift towards enabling people to start climate action groups rather than sort of joining Friends of the Earth groups. I think that's a really interesting example of this. I think RSPB are doing some lovely stuff we're a bit involved in on kind of reinventing membership as participation. I think so. I think it's. I mean, I could go anywhere, like go to unions and say, well, what if unions could renew their role as actually being collectives of people trying to figure out how to do those jobs better and how to create the conditions for them to do them better, not just sort of resistance movement, sort of resistance functions framed entirely against government, for example. So there's I think you could take it almost anywhere once you start to see it like this, but the fundamental thing is you're going, what are we trying to do in the world? And then how do we enable people to do that through us and with us, rather than us doing it for them? And that I think is the fundamental of the shift from either a subject or a consumer mentality actually to a citizen mentality. What are we trying to do? How do we enable people to do it rather than trying to do it for them or to them?
It's seeing the shifts at somewhere like National Trust, I think, makes it feel possible. It's easy to hear, I think, new concepts and think, well, that's great ideologically, but what's it like in practice? And I was really struck in the book, there's just the simplicity of a triangle that you described there, that talks about the relationship that National Trust had, where it did stuff for special places, and basically it took stuff from people, and that connection that was missing to connect people to special places. I think all of the organisations that might want to tune into this conversation have their own version of that triangle, the kind of, the people connecting to the cause that you're working in. When I was working at Parkinson's UK, we were doing a really good job of doing things for people with Parkinson's. We were not doing a very good job of connecting people with solving Parkinson's directly until we started on more of that journey. You said a brilliant just a quick throwaway line when you were talking about that National Trust example of, and crowdsourcing that list of stuff for 101 things to do. You're like, well, that's quite a big shift for some of these organizations. The idea of crowdsourcing isn't necessarily that common still, but is a really, so it's interesting that it's so ingrained in your thinking that, obviously crowdsourcing the ideas is something that just is naturally part of the citizen way of doing things. I don't know whether you've got any further reflections on that.
I think you're right, and I think it's just because, and this is sort of why I started by making that sort of basic assertion about human nature, because if you see people as fundamentally creative, collaborative, caring, like you have to start by going, how do we involve them? Like, what can they contribute? Rather than going, what can we do for them? How can we serve them? It's like I think what it maybe does to methodologies like crowdsourcing or citizen science or like open policy making, if you start to go into the world of government, or crowdfunding or all of this stuff, is it says, don't see these as isolated phenomena. These are tools these are methodologies of the citizen story. And I think, like, I'm not trying to claim like any kind of any sort of, like, this isn't my story, right? It's just what I'm trying to offer, I think, is a name that helps us see this as something whole, and therefore more than the sum of its parts. And I think that is that's what's really important, if anything, about this work, is it's going, don't just see crowdsourcing or a bit of a crowdfunding project or a citizens assembly or a whatever as a thing you can do on the edges of your work. See it as an expression of a fundamental shift in what the organization perceives its role in the world as being. And so like with the National Trust, like, yes, the couple of examples I gave you were the sort of big totemic things, but a lot of the work there, and that needs to keep being sustained. And I don't know, I'd be interested in your reflections on where this was in Parkinson's, for example, but like was paying attention to the small things, that actually the rituals of the organization that keep it trapped in those older mindsets, in those mindsets that need to die. So the trust, we put a lot of effort into, like, how do people meet each other in the organization? When you meet someone new, try and share a place that's special to you, so you remind yourself that you're not just your job title, but you're actually someone who cares about special places, about beauty. When you, like, we changed the names of meeting rooms and made sure that all the photography of the organization always had people enjoying places in it, rather than just sort of drama shots of place. And those sorts of, we measured different things and reported on different things, so that we weren't just sort of reporting visitor numbers, we were reporting like connection scores, that kind of thing. And these sorts of rituals, I think there's a lovely phrase that what you pay attention to matters, and what you pay attention to grows, right? And so much, I think that one of the reasons why the consumer story is so tenacious and is proving so difficult to shift in this moment in time is because it manifests in all of these little things. It manifests in funding, in the questions that are on a funding proposal that we have to respond to. It manifests in the job titles that we have. It manifests in all of these things, and it makes it so hard to break out of, because it's very hard to sustain a different way of thinking in the face of these constant prompts. And so I think that's, like, for all that it is about the kind of the lovely projects of crowdsourcing and so on and so forth, it's also about acknowledging that what we're trying to do is actually fundamentally reinvent the role of our organizations and their relationship with people, and backing into from there the deep sort of cultural organizational work of addressing the everyday prompts that keep us stuck.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And just to kind of take you back a step, you mentioned about kind of the role of these kind of techniques and habits and rituals in policy making, and actually there's so many interesting examples in the book about that space. And I think as non-profits who spend a lot of time focusing on affecting social change and trying to influence at all of the right levels, sometimes feeling quite battered by that, sometimes, you know, certainly personally losing faith in what's happening in democracy a bit. Actually, the book really restored some of my faith in what's possible, that just because we're going through a particular moment of a move back towards maybe a more subject era mindset in our politics, actually change is possible quite quickly. And I'd really love you to share maybe the example from Taiwan and what's happened there with Gov Zero, because it restored all of my sense that, yeah, this change is possible. And for organizations that focus on activism, that play a role in influencing policy, I think it's the story we need to hear.
Yeah, no, I mean, and when I was researching for the book, this was the one where I was like, A, oh my God, this is real, this can happen. And B, like, how just super cool is this? So I'll try and give you a fairly short version, but go back to 2012, and Taiwan was not unlike where we are now. Actually, there was a government was very much in a place where it was sort of trying. They had this thing called the Economic Power Up Plan, which was basically saying, shush, little people, just go shopping. We know you're kind of selfish little creatures, and we'll look after the tricky stuff, and you just look after yourselves. And a group of hackers started to organize actually originally, and they call themselves Gov Zero, as you say, for the URLs on their websites. They basically built parallel websites to government websites with the URL g0v.tw. and they said that they were forking government, which is always quite fun. And people started, and they were making it possible to vote on stuff and comment on things and upvote and sort of participate in shadow government at least. But it was giving people a conception of what the relationship between citizen and state might be. And over time, the sort of was building, and then 2014 came along, and the government tried to rush through a trade deal with mainland China. And this triggered a student protest, an Occupy-style protest, actually. Students occupied the legislature, the equivalent of the House of Commons. And the Gov Zero gang got a broadband connection in and were streaming out what the students were doing. And they were debating the clauses of the trade bill. And Gov Zero made it possible for everyone in the country to see what was happening. And then came the critical moment, in my view, which was the Speaker of the Parliament came under pressure to boot the students out. And by this time, the energy was really building. People were watching, people were talking about it. Various candidates and so on were starting to get behind the protests. But the Speaker of the Parliament still could have squished it. And that was the most likely thing for him to do, actually, because he was a member of the governing party. He was he had a nice career. Like, there was nothing for him to prove or do, and no one would ever have held him to blame for it. But he didn't. He said no, I'm not going to boot them out. This is what this space is for. And that moment was just this massive psychological flip in the country as a whole, actually. So within I think 6 months there were municipal elections. So they eventually agreed to leave on the basis that the trade deal was properly debated, and it obviously got rejected. But within 6 months there were municipal elections across the country. People candidates who'd stood alongside the protesters were voted in. Many of them didn't have speeches written in that classic way where they're like, "What, me?" And then a few months later, one of the leaders of the hacker movement, Audrey Tang, became a mentor to a government minister, because the government were like, God, we have to do things differently. From that point on, there were presidential hackathons and challenge prizes, and all this stuff started to happen. And then 2016, and there was a presidential election, and Audrey was made a minister, and many of the Gov Zero team were brought into government. And then when COVID hit, they were the people who were running the country's response, and they did amazing things. I mean, it's the most successful COVID response anywhere in the world, built on the principles of fast, fun, and fair, and like making it a national team effort to do this stuff, even down to like creating a phone line where any citizen could ring in with ideas for how the country's response could be better. And I won't go too deep into it, but it's just so exciting to see this, and so quick, right? Like from 2012, where they were one of the least open, least participatory, least sort of trusted governments in the world, to 2016 really, but then 2020 like full performance. That was an 8-year duration. And I just zooming in on that moment of trust, because the soundbite that really hit me when I interviewed Audrey Tang, the hacker turned minister, I said, people must really trust government for this to be possible. And the response was, we don't want people to trust government. We think that will follow if it needs to, but we actually kind of would rather they held us to account. What we really care about is that government trusts people. And I think that flip again is just so profound. But I feel like, and maybe you can quiz me a bit further, but as you say, like, this is a story we kind of need to hear as citizens right now, because it's not where our government is going, right? But we need to hear it because it gives us the opportunity to see that change can happen remarkably quickly, and we could be a very different country in a blink of an eye, actually. But I think it's even more important for this audience, this community, to hear, because I think Gov Zero speaks to a very different theory of change. One that to extent rejects the idea of influencing government, because it takes government as it stands today as a fundamentally flawed construct. and instead says, how do we create the modes of decision making that government has to step into? And just as a thought experiment on this, and I want to preface this by saying I have a huge amount of love for Extinction Rebellion and all the people involved in it, and I think the bravery and all of that stuff. And my thought experiment for you is what might have happened if you remember when their first rebellion kicked off, and everyone loved, like, we all knew we needed it then. Like, my mum wanted to go and stand on Waterloo Bridge like this, and she's not that lady, right? Like, for much as I love my mother, and people wanted them to succeed. And that's why, although the government didn't commission it, 6 select committees commissioned a Citizens' Assembly on climate. And it wasn't the Citizens' Assembly that Extinction Rebellion demanded. It wasn't on the right time frame. It didn't have the right powers. And as a result, XR basically dismissed it. And I can understand why. I totally can. And particularly in that time and context. But just to play with the thought experiment, what if they hadn't? What if they had said yes and to that instead of no but? And what if they had held their rebellions on the weekends that the Citizens' Assembly met, and they had drawn attention to it and pointed to it and said, this is the minimum, this is what democracy looks like in the mode of Speaker Wang, and forced that onto the national agenda, because they could have. And what if we hadn't? What if government, what if Johnson and so forth hadn't been able to ignore that? And by the way, I don't necessarily just think this is the Conservatives. I think I'm not convinced that it would have been that different under Labour. But if they had forced, and I think this is what we have to do as civil society, is I think we have to take a leaf from Gov Zero's book and say, like, we're going to need to create the next way that decisions are made. We're going to need to do the Buckminster Fuller thing of, like, we can't fight the existing reality. We can't change things by fighting the existing reality. We have to create the new system. Like, that is, from the research of the book, that's just kind of what stuck out to me all of the time. And I think we have the tools and the methodologies, and they're not that expensive, and they're doable if we ourselves in this civil society, in these organizations, can be open enough to genuinely put our trust in people and invite people to figure this out with us. And one of the examples, I'm rabbiting, but one of the other thought experiments in the book is, like, what if Oxfam and Amnesty International and were to run a process where they crowdsourced a renewal of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights? Like, how might that reset the contract of humanity with itself? Like, I think that, but can people in leadership positions in Amnesty and Oxfam and trust people? Because the great danger of the moment we're in, I believe, is that leaders and organizations are responding to the dangers of our time, too many of them, by believing that people are crap and removing trust from people, rather than believing that people are great, but when you withhold agency from them, then they understandably kick you. And because what we need to do in this time is give people agency, put power in people's hands. But there is a really worrying trend. Probably the most worrying thing I see is actually people in these organizations saying, "Oh, can we really? Like, if we put power in people's hands, they'll bring back the death penalty." And you're like,
yeah, I really hear that. I think there's something really interesting in what you were saying about the role of leaders in this. So what is it that makes, what is the difference in a kind of hacker turned minister leader like Audrey Tang, or Speaker Wang from the Taiwan story, versus, the chief exec of Oxfam? Not that I'm calling out them specifically, just, they were an organization, you mentioned chief exec of any of these kinds of potentially really powerful NGOs, versus the kind of, slightly ridiculous but seemingly powerful leaders in the world like Elon Musk. What is the magic of leadership that we need here to make the citizen story take hold?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, it's really interesting because I think the first reaction to what I'm talking about might be that it sounds like I'm talking about a leaderless world and we don't need leaders anymore. And I think because like the citizen story is such a rejection of the old construct of leadership, right? It's such a rejection of command and conquer leadership, and it's also a rejection of servant leadership, actually, which have been the kind of dominant strands in leadership thinking. But it's not a rejection of leadership as such. I think it's a proposal that leaders need to. Well, Audrey's language when I interviewed when in our interview was I'm not here. I'm a channel, was the language, and it's like I'm a connector, and I'm a space holder and a convener and a channel, and I think that that kind of leadership that says like we need to stand in place, and if the door, and look, I think to some degree one of the reasons I think I hope I can be a useful voice for this kind of work is because I sort of I am the system, right? Like I'm 40 years old, 6 foot tall, white, straight bloke. Like I am poshly educated. I am the system, but as a result of that, like I can pass maybe in those spaces, and I can talk to people who look and sound like me and say we need to do this. Like the really courageous thing, the really leaderly, heroic thing, isn't to try and fix it for people or to tell people what to do. The really courageous thing is to hold the space, to pass the mic, to open the door, and maybe I can do some of that because I'm talking to all too often to people who look and sound like me. But I think that is the behavior. It's like how do we see ourselves and the role of leadership as a task of opening and inviting and enabling and unleashing, rather than a task of either commanding or like serving and heroing. I think it's got to be different. It's got to be bigger than that.
I think there's real lessons in that for how I would have done things differently, thinking in that mode maybe earlier in my career when I was in leadership roles, probably for all of us on it. I'm conscious that it's 45 minutes in and I haven't left room for anyone else's questions. What I would like to do though is I guess ask you to bring this back to the kinds of organisations and people who'll be tuning into this, and ask the question about like how do we make changes ourselves in the kinds of organisations, fields, causes that we work in? What is the shift that we need to make that makes these changes real for us in our own world?
I think I think there's maybe two aspects to this. I think one is the sort of very personal thing of what it means to embrace this idea of what it is to work for change in the world. And I think it's quite challenging precisely because it's so different to the sort of consumer mode of working for change in the world. This is an explicit rejection of like, do one thing, do the 5 things that fix the world for a $5 or whatever like that. It's not about the sort of the individual behavior changes. It's precisely because the first step is actually to go, where do I belong? Where do I want to contribute? And then the second step is to go, who's my first other? How do I find the others? Who am I going to do this with? Actually, and who do I do this with actually comes before what are we going to do? I think like one of the lovely discoveries in the book, in the research for the book, was that the word citizen literally means together people. And I think that's from a sort of very personal perspective. I think that's a really big part of it. It's not like what's the first change you can make. It's who's the first person you can work with. And then I guess at an organizational level, and I think this applies individually as well. But the third section of the book's divided into 3 sections, and the first is really about like this, like we are citizens, like believe that, and here's all the evidence, and the tragedy of the commons is complete horse, and like all of this, like just getting rid of some of that stuff and going boom. Second part of the book's about stories and about subject and consumer and why they were so powerful, but how they shift. And the third part is about going, so what do organizations need to do in this story? And it's built around this set of 3 principles that we've developed in our Workers' New Citizenship project, each of which has a question to them. And the 3 principles are 3 principles of participatory organizations: purpose, platform, and prototype, which basically is an explicit attempt to replace the 4 Ps of marketing, right? And quite deliberate, conscious decision. But the 3 Ps are purpose, platform, prototype. And the questions that go along with them are purpose. What are you trying to do in the world? And actually even more than that, what are you trying to do in the world that's so big that you need people to do it with you? You can't just do it for them because it's too big for you to do it on your own. And that speaks to some of the transformation work that whichever side of me you are, Julie, you were saying at the beginning. So what are you trying to do in the world? And like really big, like, and then the second one, platform, is about saying not product or whatever, not what do you sell people, but how do you create the opportunities for people to do it with you? How do you make it joyful and meaningful? Not easy and convenient, because actually that's not really what motivates people, but joyful and meaningful to do this work. Because then people feel you're speaking to their agency and you're building it with them. And that's what we most deeply want. And then the third principle, prototype, is about going, you can't necessarily just flip it overnight. Like for all the Taiwan, and I think it sounds like a contradiction to the idea of Taiwan changing so dramatically, because it feels like if you're going to do anything fast, you have to do it all at once. But I mean, I know this is something probably absolutely in the comfort zone. I know of you, Julie, and I know, and probably of many in the ECF. Like prototyping, agile thinking is all about going, you actually move an awful lot quicker if you start with small stuff and build and iterate and go where the energy is, and you'll find that it transforms very rapidly. So those are the thinking tools I would offer. Like, what are you trying to do in the world? How do you create the spaces and opportunities for joyful, meaningful involvement in that work? And how do you start small, build, iterate, and also like start with what's good already? The slight additional thought, but I love. I've been working a bit with a guy called Cormac Russell in the democracy sector, and he has this lovely phrase in this space. He says, "Too often we start with what's wrong, and we all feel rubbish as a result." And he has, in his lilting Irish voice, he goes, "What if we start with what's strong and use what's strong to fix what's wrong?" And I apologize to anyone who ever hears this, including Cormac, for my desperate Irish accent, but it's so much better in that accent. But start with what's strong and use what's strong to fix what's wrong, I think, is very much in that kind of prototype spirit.
I've just jotted down that as a quote that I will use without doing a bad Irish accent to deliver it. But I think that whole idea of, we start talking about problems all the time, and sometimes the problems need acknowledging, but actually, where's the room for talking about our strengths? Exactly what you were saying about, the citizenness is in all of us. It is a strength. And if we play to that, then we might see results pretty quickly, rather than starting with the problem that people aren't good enough to make this change happen, which the stories in the book demonstrate is just not true.
And it's just on that, like to this thing about like, how do you make this happen in organizations? That's a really good example of where this kind of where the kind of consumer story, the heroic leadership, shows up. Because so often I've heard people in positions of leadership say and sort of look clever by saying, but what's the problem we're trying to solve here? And everyone's like, oh yes. And it's like, no, like, sod off. I'm sorry. Like, and like, I think this, in a way, this is why I've written the book, is just to go like, it's really hard to call out or call in that kind of behavior, because it's so normal. and what I'm really talking about is the creation of an entirely new normal, and it's both like beautifully simple to do, and so hard, because the kind of gravitational pull of the old ways of doing it are so heavy.
Yeah. We're almost out of time. To maybe play back at just a couple of the things that I jotted down during this, which is you use the phrase "what you pay attention to grows," and what you pay attention to matters. And it feels like more energy on these ideas, these examples, this sense of ourselves as citizens in our personal lives as well as in our professional lives will start to grow that change. And I think it's so true. Also, I mean, definitely that Cormac quote, and I can see there's a question just briefly about what was the name of that chap, Cormac?
That's a quick answer. Cormac Russell.
That was an easy one. Cormac Russell.
His book, if our magical link finder is looking, is called Rekindling Democracy. It's obviously the second book you should read, yes, rather than the first.
This one first. Yeah, I mean, there's a book, you should read it. Actually, you really should read it. And it's easy for me to say that as somebody who knows Jon, but it's full of examples that I didn't know before that I've already started using in my work. So it's not one of those books that just sells an idea. It gives the tools and the stories that make change possible, when people might doubt it if they just hear it as a theory. So I really do recommend buying it and reading it. I wanted to come back to the other thing that you said about when I asked you where organisations like ours should start, and you said, well, don't start with what you're going to do, start with who you're going to do this with. And again, let's ask ourselves the question, like, who can we do that with? I ran a workshop this morning with an organisation where we'd facilitated them spending some time with, we called idea builders, people who were in their sphere but not connected to their organisation currently. And one of the people in that workshop said, I felt really bad that we didn't do that normally, because when I was in that session with those idea builders, it just instinctively felt like the right way to do everything we do. And it just came across so powerfully for them. They'd enjoyed it so much. It was so uplifting for them. It was so joyful for them. And I think, coming back to the Taiwan example, I love that their COVID response had the word fun in it. We're allowed to give ourselves permission to have fun. And the last thing I will ask you to do, Jon, you cut yourself off whilst you were just about to tell the story of the phone line. And I think everybody deserves to hear that little story as a final little positive moment.
Okay, very good. I like that as a climactic point. So what happened was, so as I say, there was a phone line set up where any citizen could ring in with ideas for how the country's response could be better, with a voicemail recorded by the president herself. And probably the fact that the president was a herself is not entirely coincidental to what happened in Taiwan, by the way. But yeah, one of the people who rang into this phone line was a 6-year-old boy. And what he was ringing in to say was that the kids in his class, and actually in his brother's class in particular, weren't wearing their regulation face masks because they were pink and they thought they were a bit girly, frankly, and not cool. And so his suggestion was to do something to make pink face masks cool. And he suggested working with the national baseball team. Because baseball is such a popular sport. 3 days later, from what Audrey tells me, 3 days later, not only on the presidential press conference, you had not only the 6-year-old boy, but also half of the Taiwanese baseball team resplendent in their pink face masks. And I just just contrast that so deeply with like where we've been over the last few years. I was struck so powerfully just the other day, and I think by the way that we're seeing so much of this citizen energy, whether it's in what the Anonymous Collective are doing, or whether it's in sort of people like using Airbnb and so forth to transfer money directly to people in Ukraine and so on. But I was struck so powerfully by this moment just the other day when the website for offering your home to Ukrainian refugees in the UK, the website crashed, and the Guardian's chief political correspondent, who I love, by the way, Jessica Elgar, is great. But she tweeted, "Incredible generosity crashes website." And I was like, I'm pretty sure that it's 2 years, almost to the day since a website called the NHS First Responders was set up. And was with an anticipated traffic of 250,000 users in 2 weeks, and got 750,000 in 48 hours and crashed. And I guess, like, and we've just seen it again, and we still call it incredible. And I'm just a bit like, what if we didn't see that? Like, what if we designed for that? What if we actually started by going, people, we know that if we offer something that's genuinely commensurate with the scale of the challenge we face, and we make it like something to be proud of doing, and we make the user experience like work and all that stuff, but we basically offer people something to do that means that they genuinely are contributing on a scale that's commensurate with the scale of the challenges. We want to do that. Like, that is who we are as human beings. And so let's not be surprised when people do that. Let's design for it, and let's offer it whenever and wherever we can. And that really, I guess, is the sort of the final message of the book. The sentence I close the book on is a question that I try and ask myself constantly, because it is hard to live in this world where the dominant story isn't that we're citizens. And so the question I hold to try and sort of keep me in this is, what would you do today? What would you do in this moment if you really believed in yourself and in those around you? Like, and I think I guess I just offer that, and I decided to close the book with it because I think it's just a really little simple way of going, no, people, we can do this. People rock. Like, give them a chance.
I've just seen a comment, question just popped up. I don't know if in the final 2 minutes we can answer, well, you can answer it, John, which is, from how you describe citizen-led work, would you characterize the Ukrainian resistance as citizen-led? And are there any other examples you would use of that? So, yeah.
I absolutely would. Like, I mean, the day that I think there was a particular day when Zelensky made us. I mean, obviously, like the frame is that. So the idea of people as citizen soldiers and so on is. I don't know if people have seen the film that they made where people were saying, I'm a bartender for now. I make Molotov cocktails, but then I'm going back to my job as an accountant. And it's like, and just the sort of, that is an expression of. It's a very direct and literal expression, but it is an expression. The moment that for me was most powerful was when Zelensky on February 24th, I think it was, made a speech in Russian addressing the citizens of Russia explicitly, not as president, he said, but as a citizen of Ukraine, and saying, like, we're brothers and sisters, we're family and friends, and then turning out and to the citizens of the world and saying, share this, like, I need your help to get round Russian censorship. And it was arguably that directed and gave a brief to the Anonymous Collective and to all of us to go, like, we need to get information in there. And people started like posting accurate information onto restaurant reviews on Google Maps and all this stuff. So it's absolutely there. And Zelensky, I think, is a wonderful example of a leader seeking to open that agency. And so I think, and which is part of the reason why I think this moment in time, these weeks are another huge opportunity to cultivate and step into, whoever we are and in whatever organizations we are. And as I said before, some of the civil society organizations actually have most agency in this. And we can start to build some of those speaker wang moments, those inflection points, because that's I think what's ultimately going to transform this.
Well, we are out of time, John. Thank you so much. So if people have enjoyed this, they want to learn more, Citizens, Why the Key to Fixing Everything is all that's out now. But yeah, I know that, I hope that this has been really interesting for people. So yeah, thank you so much.
It has been absolutely fascinating. So thank you, both of you, for coming on and spending the time on this. I'm going to be then pushing this video to make sure other people see it and connect and learn more about it, because it's something that I think is underrepresented, and I may even be in touch to talk about sort of what more we can do to keep pushing it out there. So I will be in touch, not just may be in touch, but I will be in touch. So thank you very much for that, and for your time. And yeah, sort of I'll sort of start looking at more of those examples, and I need to go and order the book.
Indeed you do, as does everyone.
Exactly.
Thanks all.
Thank you very much. Cheers.